Okay, I'm nervous. I've tried to make one of these things 3 times now, and it stopped about 2 minutes in. But I'm going to try again. If it doesn't work this time, I'm going to go see Coach Long. Let me go to making this big. So I'm going to start with containment. I'll go back to the PowerPoints in a second, but I'm just going to see if it'll work for a little while before I pull up the PowerPoints. And I think the first three or four or five of them really are kind of straightforward. So I think we remember containment is our policy where we're going to stop the spread of communism. It's based on the lesson of World War II appeasement. You don't appease a dictator. You nip things in the bud. You stop him before he gets too much power. Nobody stood up to Hitler until it was too late. So we're going to stand up to Stalin. Truman is. And the early Cold War events are coming out of the Truman years. Okay, the Cold War itself is this hostile relationship. It's a standoff. It's a not quite shooting war between the U.S. and the Soviet Union, who are the two superpowers at the end of World War II. They're opposites economically and politically. We have a capitalist democracy. They had a communist dictatorship. We're both kind of expansionist. The containment policy was a response to the Iron Curtain, where Stalin has taken over the countries of Eastern Europe, and what he wants is a buffer after World War II to make sure that he doesn't get attacked again. So it's complicated, and its causes y'all have written on that topic as a DBQ. Three particular bills. I'm starting to get mildly optimistic about this thing. It hasn't stopped yet. Three particular policies of Truman during the Cold War. Policy number one, the Truman Doctrine. That's $400 million to Greece and Turkey. $400 million worth of military aid to Greece and Turkey to stop the spread of communism. The Marshall Plan was somewhere between 12 and 14 billion, not million, but billion dollars to rebuild Western Europe right after World War II. So it's reconstruction of Western Europe, kind of like reconstruction of South after the Civil War. Very successful. None of those countries of Western Europe went communist. Okay, the GI Bill is what Congress is passing right after World War II because we're concerned about, I think the number's 12 million soldiers who are coming back home, and so the economy is good after World War II, but if all of a sudden you got 12 million people looking for jobs, you're right back to depression. So it's also known as the GI or Servicemen's Bill of Rights, and it's helping guys go to college, giving them loans for businesses and to buy houses. And the idea is you don't want young, angry men. The GI Bill is trying to avoid young, angry, unemployed men in the same sense that the CCC was during the New Deal. Remember that one? All right. And then we've got Eisenhower here. I like Ike. And so this was during the age of Democratic success. You got 4 for 5 Democrats. You got Roosevelt and Truman, then the Republican Eisenhower, followed by Kennedy and Johnson. In politics, that's called a realignment when one political party is dominating things. And so Eisenhower's challenge is to get elected as a Republican despite the Democratic mood of the country, so he focused on his personality and his personal popularity rather than the political positions of the Republican Party. And as president, he was really very moderate, and in fact, his number one accomplishment is the interstates, the building of the interstates, which is in fact, the biggest, most massive public works project in history. All right, nothing has fallen apart. Let's hope that it continues this way. All right, I'm going to come over here for the reasons for the boom, and that one is over here. So we're going, remember that one, the amiable boob? So you're going all the way back to Harding at the beginning of that PowerPoint. And so here it is. The boom, the income's going great. The economy's going great at the end of the war. And here's why. It spells out more. Military spending, gives people jobs. They spend money. We're getting cheap oil from the Middle East. This is before the days of OPEC, jacking up the oil prices in the 70s with stagflation. We're producing a whole lot, rising productivity, and our educational levels rising. By the 1950s, half of American kids are in school. So more. Military spending, oil, productivity, and education. Okay, let's go back to the review sheet. And it's to the Eisenhower year, so we can now go to post-war America. And let's look at what it says. That's like, so there's the books. So remember we talked about Elvis. So he's kind of he's one of your early rebels through the 50s. Marilyn Monroe on the first cover of Playboy. But all these books are making the case that the 50s affluent society, to use the name of one of the books, is, hey, we're making money, but it's boring. It ain't the Depression. That's good. It's not D-Day where we're getting killed by Nazis. That's good. But it's still lacking in something, so much conformity in the 1950s. All right, so if we go back to the review sheet, let's see what we got. So the next thing it's going with is going straight to Kennedy. Let me go back over here to the PowerPoint for a second. You want to, what was it? So there's I Like Ike. Remember that awful thing he said about the egghead? Isn't that offensive? I still can't believe. Guy's got a reputation of being a nice guy. He says that egghead thing. That's awful. All right, Korean War. Coming out of Korea in the fall of China, McCarthyism, where you've got that guy accusing everybody of being communist and nobody wants to stand up to him. So we don't want to forget about that. Let's go back to the review sheet, see if we got anything else. Massive retaliation. So massive retaliation is the Eisenhower Cold War policy. Let's see if what I have. Egghead. You can believe that. Civil rights, not yet. I don't want to do civil rights just yet. Let's see what we have. There it is. Rollback and massive retaliation. In other words, anytime the communists threaten to spread somewhere, what he's going to do is threaten to nuke the communists. Now, it wasn't very effective. The communists came to see that, the Soviets came to see that as bluffing. And what he wants to do is spend less money on conventional soldiers, tanks, other kinds of guns, rather than nuclear weapons, and stay out of war while saving money at the same time. In Vietnam with the French and Hungary, wasn't very effective. All right, looks like we're going to Kennedy next. New Frontier. So how are we going to do that? Let's go Kennedy, and then we'll go to the civil rights stuff. So two things on Kennedy, the New Frontier. He's idealistic and inspirational in his rhetoric. So America in the 60s is going to be more inspirational and exciting with this young new president than it had been in the 50s, the boring conformity 50s with the old grandfather president. And the New Frontier is literally going to be space and putting a man on the moon. But a lot of the New Frontier programs are going to be civil rights and Medicare, helping senior citizens and the disadvantaged in one way or another. The New Frontier is going to become Johnson's Great Society when Johnson becomes president. Kennedy has the best and the brightest working for him. So if we get to Kennedy, there he is. So Bobby Kennedy, his attorney general, was this very young man. And then probably the most tragic figure of his impressive young advisors is Robert McNamara, who's kind of the architect of the Vietnam policy. He's the guy that announced the Tonkin Gulf incident. And so he looks good early on, and then he's going to end up being the guy behind the thinking in Vietnam. So it doesn't turn out well for really the best and the brightest here. There's a book called The Best and the Brightest, and it's a sad book about how all these guys started out great with Kennedy and then failed the country in Vietnam. Okay, so then we're going back to the civil rights stuff. So if we go right back here, where is it? 2 slides. All right, Robinson integrating baseball in 1947 with the Brooklyn Dodgers. Branch Rickey's the guy who signed him. Truman integrated the military with an executive order. What's the number? 9066? I can never remember those dang executive order numbers. Or 9981. I can't keep them straight. So the Korean War was the first war fought with an integrated military. Emmett Till was killed, I believe, 1955. He's from Chicago. Family moved north in the Great Migration. He comes back to Mississippi for the summer and whistles at a white lady and gets killed and has an open casket funeral. His mother keeps the casket open so that everybody can see, what they had done to her son. All right, Brown versus Board of Education is the court case. Earl Warren is the liberal Chief Justice, and Thurgood Marshall was the lawyer for the NAACP. It says two things, really. First off, separate's never equal. They did sociology studies on African-American children in the South and asked them to choose between Barbie dolls, and the kids always picked the white Barbie doll. These were elementary school kids, so when asked why, they had just always answered, well, this one's better. They couldn't quite articulate it. Then a year later, the Supreme Court says you got to desegregate with all deliberate speed. That speed ended up being quite slow because the schools don't really integrate until the early 1970s. Okay, we got one more, right? There it is. Montgomery bus boycott is 1955. We first hear about Rosa Parks. That's her moment. She kind of fades as a civil rights leader after Montgomery, but Martin Luther King becomes the leader of the Christian group, the SCLC, Southern Christian Leadership Conference. All right, Eisenhower, didn't like Brown versus Board of Education. And yet, he sent in the troops to force the governor of Arkansas, Faubus, to let those 9 kids attend Central High School in Arkansas, the Little Rock Nine. They shut down the school for a year, but in 1958, those kids attended Central High. But it was so much trouble that other southern cities didn't really attempt to replicate what was done in Little Rock. Okay, so then you got the freedom rides and the sit-ins. So the sit-ins are in 1960. SNCC is the college kid group. There's a picture of a sit-in, and so they would sit in at a segregated lunch counter, and the local tough guys would cuss at them and dump stuff on them and maybe beat on them, in which case they would get arrested. The result was that not too much happened, but a few lunch counters were integrated. It's going to be followed in 61 by the freedom rides, which is on another slide, not exactly right here. And in the freedom rides, the group is CORE, Congress of Racial Equality. John Lewis was part of that as well. Remember, John Lewis is our chicken preacher friend who's up there on the wall on the left side of the room. And they rode south on Greyhound buses and got arrested in Mississippi. Got beat up in Alabama, got arrested in Mississippi. All right, let's see what we have. Let's go back to the review sheet. So then you're moving on to other civil rights stuff. So, hey, why don't you take a second and review? I'm going to pause and breathe for a second and look for more civil rights stuff. Cuba, and notice, Cuba, the Bay of Pigs, Cuban Missile Crisis, somehow or another. I don't believe it's on the review sheet. Obviously, that's a big deal. We ought to know about it. Lasted 13 days, closest we ever came to a nuclear war. And they made a deal to end the crisis that we'd get the missiles out in exchange for leaving Castro alone. All right, so there's that moment right there. So back to the civil rights. So there's the freedom rides. There's John Lewis and his buddy who got beat up. Anywhere you see the little spots and so forth, that's blood from where they got beat up. That was in 1961. 1963 is the year of Birmingham and the March on Washington. So a letter from Birmingham jail, King is responding to white preachers criticizing him in Birmingham, saying two things. Number one, you got a duty to disobey. He's making trouble and he's disobeying the law. And he says, with the law's unjust, he's got a duty to disobey an unjust law. I was reading it for the government class over the weekend, and one of the things it says is never forget that everything Hitler did in Germany was legal, and the people who stood up for the Jews were illegal. Everything the communists did in their countries was legal. The people who stood up to the communists in those countries were illegal. So, and he's also saying the white moderates are a bigger impediment to the civil rights movement than the Ku Klux Klansman is, because the Klan, you at least know where he stands, and he stands up for his convictions, even if his convictions are so very wrong-headed. Following that, you have the Children's March. All right, and the Children's March, well, the design of the goal of the Children's March was to fill the jails. That would shut down Birmingham. And it turned violent after the first day, and Kennedy was watching on TV and was troubled by it, so he proposes the Civil Rights Act. We remember that Kennedy wasn't very good at getting laws passed, so the March on Washington in August of 1963 was designed to win support for the Civil Rights Act. The I Have a Dream speech at the end of the March on Washington, trying to get support for the Civil Rights Act. Okay. You know, we know about the assassination. I'm going to go down here to Johnson. Remember all that stuff? That's fun. Surely I've got something where you've got the civil rights. Well, I guess I'll just go to the review sheet and talk about that stuff. Okay. See what I got. All right. So at the end of the, 64 and 65 is the culmination of the civil rights movement. So Johnson becomes president, uses the treatment, uses the image of the fallen hero Kennedy to get the Civil Rights Act passed, which outlaws Jim Crow laws. And then in 1965, you have a March on Selma. Lewis is one of the leaders. They get beat up on TV. Johnson comes on TV, makes a speech like Kennedy had, proposes the Voting Rights Act, and that's kind of the end. That's the high point of the civil rights movement. Okay, then you're going to Vietnam, right? So let's go over here to Vietnam, see what we have. All right, there we go. There's all the, so hey, the Voting Rights Act got put in with the Great Society, and the acronym for the Great Society is MEIV, Medicare, Medicaid, Education, Immigration, Voting Rights. All right. The late 60s, the civil rights movement turned militant. Malcolm X is the most famous, any means necessary, militant civil rights leader. The Black Panthers operated out of Oakland in the late 1960s and advocated violence. California Governor Ronald Reagan actually signed one of the nation's first gun control laws in the late 60s when the Black Panthers brought semi-automatic weapons into the State House. All right, there were nationwide riots when Martin Luther King was killed in 1968. The high point of the civil rights movement is 64, 65. All right, so here comes Vietnam. All right, let's see what the review sheet says about Vietnam. All right, so what's getting us into Vietnam is going to be, so that's like the background. They're forever fighting off the invader here with this slide. Johnson believed in the domino theory that you better do something about communism spreading. And so the thing that gets us involved there is the Tonkin Gulf Resolution. So you got these boats off the coast of North Vietnam and the Gulf of Tonkin, and they may have been shot at. Probably one of them was shot at. But Congress passes this thing that gives Johnson the power to do anything he wants in Vietnam, to take all necessary measures to defend South Vietnam from the communists, send as many troops as he wants for as long as he wants. And that set up, the problems of the soldiers that are fighting in the jungle there. You can't see the enemy. When you see the person, you can't tell if he's friend or foe. All right, so there's Tonkin Gulf. Next thing I've got there is My Lai Massacre. All right, so we're moving on. And so the My Lai Massacre is part of the solution to the problem. If you're frustrated, you can't tell who the enemy is, you kill everybody. Even if the people you're killing are innocent women and children, senior citizens, and in particular at My Lai, soldiers had been shot at for a day or two and lost some of their buddies, and so they're just kind of taking out their frustrations on the people of this village. none of whom are Viet Cong soldiers. And this is a picture of that. And a little while later, everybody in that picture was killed. His evidence that it's going well, the body counts, the turning point of the war was the Tet Offensive, in which the body counts are proven to be misleading because the North Vietnamese attacked something like 25 different cities in South Vietnam. And it was on TV, and our guys just executing Viet Cong guy on live TV. So we're not feeling like the good guys here. It's really, really breaking Johnson. Remember, we're spraying the Agent Orange on the jungle so that we can see, and that's causing birth defects and so forth. All right, let's see what I have. So sad stuff about Johnson. I'm going back to the logic of the review sheet here. Somewhere in the Nixon section, it's going to tell you about the War Powers Act. So there's the Tet Offensive. The War Powers Act was in response to Johnson's too many powers during Vietnam. And it's going to say today, if the president's sending troops, he's got to tell Congress within 48 hours. He can only leave them there for 2 months, for 60 days until he gets congressional approval. And if they don't give him approval, he's got a month to get them out. So that's the kind of the last part of Vietnam. If we go back up here, we're looking at late 60s politics, really. Okay, so there it is. Nope. All right, so you got the generation gap. And the Hawks and the Doves. So the Hawks were in favor of the war. They didn't understand the Doves, who tend to be much younger, tend to be college kids. So there's a cultural divide. You know, the parents had survived the Depression, fought in World War II, stormed the beaches of Normandy, done their duty as they understood it. College kids don't want to go to war. They're protesting. They become the counterculture, so they see America as hopelessly racist, militarist, consumerist, conforming. And so they rejected everything about kind of 50s culture. So these are the hippies, and there's quite the divide between them. All right, let's see what the review sheet says next. So coming out of this is kind of that, so that's the generation gap. There's the Hawks and Doves. Chicago 68 is the Democratic Convention. Let's see if we can find it. Don't see it, don't see it, don't see it. Looks like we got, let's see if we can find it. There it is. So in 68, at the Democratic Convention, you have a police riot outside because college kids are protesting, but they're not going to Martin Luther King and turn the other cheek. They're throwing glasses of pee and poop at the police, many of whom are Vietnam War veterans. So a police riot breaks out, and they just really beat the snot out of the protesters. And it's on TV. Everybody's watching on TV. So they conclude that it's time for Republicans. It helps Nixon win. All right, if we go back, see if we're close to the bottom of the left side. Not so much. All right, why don't you pause and review for a second. Let me take a couple of breaths, and then I'm going to hit the bottom half of the review sheet. Okay, I think what I'm going to do, no, I'm not. Let me go ahead and talk about it for a second, then I'll go back to the PowerPoint. All right, so we're looking at Nixon's presidency now. So he uses the Southern strategy, so he kind of talks in coded language. Law and order is one way of describing the fact that a lot of Southerners don't like civil rights. And the silent majority are his supporters who don't protest, don't make trouble. They go to work and they support the war. And so first Nixon, then following him Reagan is going to be riding the backlash to civil rights and the anti-war movement, and then also subsequent social movements coming in the 70s. When he becomes president, he's Vietnamizing the war. He's going to turn the war over to the Vietnamese gradually. There it is. And so you see you got 500,000 troops when he takes office. By the time we exit 1973, we only had 20,000. There's still protests. 4 were killed at a protest at Kent State University in Ohio. And so, I mean, it's still a controversial thing. But as less and less troops are in Vietnam, there's generally speaking less protest. And Nixon is a fairly popular president and is handling this gradual withdrawal fairly effectively. May not have been the right thing to do, but it's pretty good politics. Okay, so then you're going Nixon and there we go, triangular diplomacy. So he's going to China, sends the ping pong team first, Forrest Gump, and he makes nice with his enemy, Mao Zedong, in order to make the Soviets nervous. And the Soviets, in fact, get nervous when he makes nice with China and reach out to Nixon, and they achieve this easing of tensions, and they sign, most famously, the SALT Treaty, which puts a limit on nuclear weapons. So the triangle is between the United States, China, and the Soviet Union. And so Nixon's kind of playing off China against the Soviet Union. All right, let's look what I have. Okay, so there it is. So stagflation's next. And I saw it on the slide, didn't you? We're just going backwards. There it is. All right, so stagflation, you got loss in productivity because you've got unskilled workers, women, and teenagers, and also declining investment in machinery and infrastructure. You're seeing the beginning of the decline of American industry. Japan and Germany in particular are kind of starting to catch up with us in terms of producing electronics and cars. Also, prices are going up because of the Vietnam War spending, generally speaking, without raising taxes. And then also oil prices. You're having OPEC kick in here. And so stagflation is this strange combination of high unemployment and inflation, which are not supposed to go together. Let's see what we got. George Wallace was the governor of Alabama during Birmingham, during the Civil Rights era. Then he runs as kind of a backlash independent candidate. So he's an intermediate candidate between the solid Democrat South, which culminates in Lyndon Johnson, and the South going Republican, starting with Nixon and being solidified really in the Reagan years. And he ran for president a couple of times as an independent. He got shot. Didn't die. And ended up being pro-civil rights. Got elected governor of Alabama later as a pro-civil rights. And I think it was Democrat again. I think he never became a Republican. All right. What else? You know Watergate. So Watergate is the motel. See if we can get a picture of it. Watergate. There it is. Guys working for Nixon are breaking in. There's the War Powers Act. And they're working for Nixon. He claims he doesn't have anything to do with it, but he taped all the conversations and didn't want to turn over the tapes. He claimed executive privilege, that there's national security stuff on the tapes. Supreme Court said, okay, fine, you don't have to turn over the national security stuff, but you do have to turn over the stuff related to Watergate, which resulted in him having to resign before he got impeached and convicted. Okay, I believe next is going to be all this social movement stuff. All right. Do we have the women's movement there? It can come in here somewhere. All right, let's take a look at the review sheet to kind of guide us right quick. So what's it going to say? All right, first thing is going to be the Warren Court. So we got the Supreme Court, and I believe we got the right slide. So there it is. The Warren Court was a very liberal court, even though Earl Warren had been the Republican governor of California. So there's the specific court cases. Brown versus Board of Education is integrating the schools, desegregating the schools. Engel versus Vitale was the case that outlawed school prayer. Gideon versus Wainwright, the court seems to be on the side of the accused, where you have the right to an appointed attorney. Griswold versus Connecticut, remember that was a birth control case. Griswold, we think Griswold, hey, I was reading something, an article about, the vacation movies, and it was making the case that the vacation movies are actually very pro-family movies. So those pro-family values and being threatened by women's rights and the right to privacy. There is, in fact, a connection we can make between that movie named Griswold and, women's abortion politics. So Roe versus Wade legalized abortion based on the right to his privacy that was established by the court in the Griswold case. All right, let's go back up here, see which direction we want to go from that. So then we got to find that women's liberation slide. So let's see if we can find the women's slide. Boom, 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 boom. There it is. Okay. Apparently not a very good slide. What I really need for next year when I'm going back to the drawing board, I need a whole heading on the women's movement. My goodness, said lots about civil rights, and I'm trying to squeeze feminism into one slide right here. All right, but it's called Feminism or Women's Liberation. Betty Friedan, who wrote Feminine Mystique about how boring it was to be a housewife, was the original leader of the National Organization of Women. By the 70s, which was the time not only the women's movement, but of the sexual revolution, which were connected in complicated ways, the new leader was someone who was kind of self-consciously more attractive, trying to come across as more feminine than Betty Friedan did, Gloria Steinem. And so they achieved some things and didn't achieve some things. What ladies wanted to achieve was the Equal Rights Amendment that didn't quite pass. You needed 2/3 of Congress. They got that. 3/4 of the states, which would be 38 states, didn't pass. The opposition was led by this lady, Phyllis Schlafly, who said the women's movement was bad for the family. And, of course, we see that the divorce rate did triple during the 1970s. The very successful part of the women's movement was Title IX. Title IX to the Education Act of 1972, which provided for equal funding for women's sports. But if you get kids involved in sports or extracurriculars, the argument goes here in Calhoun, educational achievement follows. And so it certainly did for ladies. And so women are, really successful educationally today coming out of Title IX. So Title IX is just a real big deal. All right. What do we have next? Okay, so the EPA, so under Nixon, you're also going to have the environmental movement. So he created the Environmental Protection Agency. I think that one is, let's work our way up. Where we got it? Somewhere. There it is. Is that it? Yeah. All right. So he's kind of a liberal. He's integrating the schools. Remember the times in the Nixon years? And he also turns out to be a very green president. So creates the EPA. It's in response to a couple of things. Rachel Carson wrote this book called Silent Spring, saying if we keep polluting the environment, all the animals are going to die and there won't be any birds singing this time of year come springtime. Also in response to a river catching on fire in Cleveland in the early 1970s. So when you got rivers catching on fire, the water's messed up. The water's polluted some kind of way. Remember Standard Oil was operating out of Cleveland. And so Nixon is kind of an unlikely, environmentalist president in certain ways, like Teddy Roosevelt was an unlikely conservationist president. Both of them kind of tough guy Republicans. Okay, so there's environmentalism. And so that gets us to Carter, and that gets us, look at there, close to the bottom. So we can take the turn here and go down to Carter. So Carter, like Reagan, like Obama, like Trump, is an outsider. If you're not from Washington, D.C., in a time when people don't like the government, that's a plus for you. So he's this religious guy from Georgia, promising never to lie, so that was a good thing. All right, but immediately comes across as kind of weak. He gives the Panama Canal back to Panama. Nice thing to do, but looks weak. Pardons the Vietnam War protesters. Compassionate thing to do, but looks weak. In foreign policy, he's going to emphasize human rights. We're only going to be nice to nice guy governments. Governments who are not dictators, who don't mistreat their people. Okay, let's go over on the review sheet, see what we got. All right, so there's all that, everything we just said. All right, so we know he's going to be ruined by Iran. So let's find Iran. The economy wasn't real good. He tried to negotiate a treaty, didn't work out. Camp David was very successful. It made peace between Egypt and Israel, so that's probably his greatest success as president. But the Shah of Iran gets overthrown. Carter lets him, and he's a bad guy dictator, like Saddam Hussein, like Assad in Syria, like Gaddafi in Libya, except he was our bad guy dictator. He was our ally, and he sold us cheap oil. So Carter kind of violated that human rights pledge. And made nice with him, and in particular let him come to the United States for medical treatment, which enraged the Iranians who had overthrown him, and so they captured these hostages for 444 days. Remember, Carter tried to rescue him. It didn't work out. The helicopters crashed each other. So is this a really humiliating time for America, coming off Vietnam, Watergate, hostage crisis. Every night on the news, day whatever of the hostage crisis. Soviets invaded Afghanistan. He responds by not sending athletes to the Olympics, also funding the Mujahideen, one of whom in Afghanistan was Osama bin Laden. All right, let's go over here. So let's see what happens. All right, so then you're going to have Reagan getting kind of close, kind of recent. And so there it is. So we're telling, hey, Reagan stuff, right? So we come back to the PowerPoint. So we're starting over is the morning in America. Remember, he was a former actor. He was good in front of the camera. Two groups of folks who liked him. Reagan Democrats. I'm not sure if I've got that. Do I have that? No, Reagan Democrats. I'm now going to type it. A Reagan Democrat is kind of a Trump voter. It's a blue-collar Democrat who sees Reagan as his guy. And so temporarily votes for Reagan for president. Then he's going to go back to the Democrats for a little while later. So blue-collar guys who had traditionally voted Democrat voted for Reagan. Again, more recently they're going to vote for Trump. Could be Southerners, but it could be working class folks in Pennsylvania, Ohio, those kind of voters. Also, you have the new right. These are Republicans voting kind of on abortion, voting for on values issues, backlash to abortion rights, women's rights, gay rights, environmentalism. They want to go back to the 50s culturally. One of Reagan's campaign slogans was a softer version of Trump. Let's make America great again. And Reagan is saying, he's also being supported by folks who say, hey, the government's gotten too big. So what was the quote? Government's not a solution to our problem. In this context, government is the problem. And there's the quote. And right away, the hostages are returned home within just a few minutes after Reagan takes office. And he handles the assassination attempt so gracefully. Remember the joke? I hope you're all Republicans to those doctors. All right. What's it going to say next? Whoops. So we got to go Star Wars, don't we? So we got to finish up Reagan. Reaganomics, he's cutting taxes, increase in military spending. Hey, you have a boom coming out of that, but it also causes a lot of debt. The deficit increases, as does inequality between the rich and the poor. The wealth never quite trickles down in the way Reagan is hoping that it's going to. All right. So there's the evil empire. He calls it the evil empire. Spends all that money on the military. And Star Wars is the big zapper in the sky, strategic defense initiative. It was going to cost too much money, the critics said. They made fun of it, called it Star Wars. They said it would never be 100% effective, but it was effective in making the Soviets flustered. So Gorbachev comes in, makes nice with Reagan, and they eventually signed the INF Treaty, which bans an entire class of nuclear weapons. And so Reagan kind of gets credit for ending the Cold War. Now you got, at the end of his time in office, the Iran-Contra, so you got some problems. His Supreme Court never really quite gets rid of abortion, like the values voters, the moral majority was hoping they were going to. Regulates it a little bit. He's got troops in the Middle East, doesn't work out. And then you got the Iran-Contra scandal, this complicated thing where Reagan or Oliver North, if Reagan didn't do it, is supporting the Contras in Nicaragua by using the profits he makes from selling arms to our old enemy Iran and overcharging them. And he's illegally sending money to the Contras because Congress had voted against sending money to the Contras who, although they weren't communists, were also kind of drug dealers and not really nice folks. There's the Contras right there. But he's Teflon presidency, nothing sticks. So even though North says Reagan knew about it, Reagan can claim he didn't quite know about it. Maybe he's going senile. Something hadn't quite happened right. He can't quite recall. So he doesn't blame for it. It's a scandal, but he doesn't get blamed for it. He's still a pretty popular president at the end of his second term. Although, as we said today, for George W. Bush, second terms don't go well. And so Reagan's second term didn't go as well as the first in a lot of ways. All right, so probably we're looking at Bush next, right? Let's go up here and see what the read sheet says about Bush. Getting close. What? The Gulf War. All right. Getting emotional when I talk about the Gulf War. Actually, I'm getting hoarse, but that's my little joke when I squeak as though I'm this teenage boy, and my voice is changing. Okay. Let me see. So he's very qualified to be president, real good qualifications in foreign policy. The Cold War officially comes to an end. There's the tank man there in China. The Berlin Wall's coming down. Remember I told you I got in the wreck when I got flustered listening to the coup attempt on the radio. Milosevic is engaged in ethnic cleansing. So in other words, the New World Order, maybe not as great as we thought it was going to be, because now you got bad guys that had been kind of suppressed by the communists in these communist countries. Mandela becomes president of South Africa. Here comes Saddam Hussein. So remember, he's invading Kuwait, which is on the Persian Gulf. So he's thinking if he can control the Persian Gulf, he's got kind of a monopoly on Middle Eastern oil. Bush says, don't do it. You're acting like a dictator, being aggressive. You're acting like Hitler. We can't appease a dictator. So the air war was for 37 days. The ground war was for 4. The Iraqi army was very anxious to surrender, so the war went very well. Bush was just a master commander-in-chief. And also, in spite of, some scandal stuff that's come out about him, maybe back in the fall, hey, an awfully successful husband. We've learned they were married for 70 years. Because Miss Bush died yesterday. Okay. See what we got. Okay, so then it's going to be the Clinton years. So we'll go down here. The campaign slogan is, "It's the economy, stupid. Don't focus on culture. Don't focus on foreign policy. Focus on the economy." He does that. And he's able to win against Bush because the economy went bad. Unemployment went up to 7% at the end of the Bush years, and he's calling himself a New Democrat, and his achievements are rather conservative. So in terms of what he does domestically as president, I would put him right in line with George H.W. Bush. So let's look at the presidency. Deficit reduction coming first. So don't ask, don't tell on the gays in the military. That was liberal at the time, but not so much today. The health care plan didn't work out, so Obama's going to try to learn from that experience. All right, but he's raising taxes a little, cutting programs a little, and so ironically, for this very undisciplined man who's very undisciplined in his personal life, very disciplined economically, and so you got a big economic boom coming out of deficit reduction. What else? The Brady bill, that's kind of liberal given today's politics, but you got a crime bill where you're throwing people in jail for a long time. It's kind of conservative. And he's doing battle throughout the last 6 years of his presidency with Newt Gingrich and the Republicans who are controlling Congress. So they're reforming welfare together, making welfare a more temporary proposition and less focused on single mothers. And in fact, it cuts in half the number of people on welfare. So you got this kind of, hey, Reagan's griping about welfare, but a couple of presidents later, it's Clinton who's kind of doing the stuff. And you got the Clinton quote, "The era of big government is over." That sounds a lot like government's not the solution to problems, government is a problem. Okay. Let's see. NAFTA is also kind of conservative, free trade, no tariffs. Kind of changed, set in motion the immigration patterns that we're familiar with today, involving Asia and Latin America as being the chief sources of immigration. See what we got? All right, so we got to impeach him, don't we? So foreign policy, fairly successful, peace and prosperity during the Clinton years. Although he regrets not going into Rwanda to stop the ethnic cleansing, and he couldn't quite make permanent peace between the Israelis and the Palestinians. Okay, so there it is. As the affair lies about it, the charge, and tries to get Lewinsky to lie about it, so the charges are perjury, obstruction of justice. You have the vote in the House to impeach him. The vote in the Senate to convict him is not close. So he stays in office, but we become ever more cynical about trusting our leaders in government. All right, so there's Bush. All right, just barely won the election, lost the popular vote. It all came down to Florida. The Supreme Court stopped the recount. Let's see what the review sheet says. So there's the impeachment. All right, so we're going to 9/11. All right, so he's the compassionate conservative. That's the plan. But then 9/11 comes along. Bin Laden and al-Qaeda did it. They're funded by the Taliban government in Afghanistan. Bin Laden resented the fact that we supported Israel and that we put troops in the Holy Land leading up to the first Iraq War. A lot of stuff and not that many more slides, so let's go straight through it. The Patriot Act is where the government's listening to phone calls and monitoring emails of terrorist suspects, some of whom may not have anything to do with terrorism. Creates Department of Homeland Security. Guantanamo in Cuba is where the terrorist suspects are held. All right, so then he goes to axis of evil. He wants to talk about good and evil, and he launches a preemptive war in Iraq because he believes, rightly, Saddam's a bad guy, wrongly, that he had weapons of mass destruction, and he implies that Saddam had something to do with 9/11, even though he knew that he didn't. Democrats in Congress, along with the Republicans, voted for the war. So John Kerry, the candidate in 2004, voted for it. Hillary Clinton voted for it. Only Obama voted against it among 2008 presidential candidates, we said today. All right, the war didn't go well over time. I mean, the government, Saddam was overthrown quickly and hung eventually, but it becomes a civil war between different Muslim sects. We never found the weapons of mass destruction. You got a couple more affirmative action cases. So in Gratz versus Bollinger, the Michigan undergrad affirmative action program was found unconstitutional because it was quantitative point system. But the Grutter versus Bollinger law school case was found constitutional. So eventually, Michigan voted out affirmative action. Bush got reelected by a little bit. Pretty close election. Not as close as in 2000. So the second term wasn't very good for Bush. He became unpopular. Stuff that was going on in Iraq, waterboarding, that pretty brutal prison in Iraq, Abu Ghraib, where you're doing bad things to the prisoners. Democrats took over both houses of Congress in 2006. Said that today. Nancy Pelosi, the first female Speaker of the House. He attempted to work with Democrats to pass comprehensive big-time immigration reform. Didn't quite get it done. All right, so Obama got elected. Yeah, race was something he had to overcome, but it was something that also, once he had overcome the perception that he might be some kind of radical, worked in his favor in getting the nomination and in winning the election. All right. Also, the fact that the economy's bad and Iraq's unpopular. McCain nominates Palin to be his vice presidential running mate. Doesn't work out. McCain didn't look good on TV because of his permanently broken arms. Obama gets elected, bails out, the banks and the corporations that depend on the housing market. Just giving us a whole lot of money would have caused runaway inflation. Obamacare eventually orders everyone to have health insurance. And so Republicans said, hey, you're not allowed to order people to buy stuff. We're ordered to have car insurance, so it's kind of modeled on that. Jorge pointed that out the third time I called that, so that was very good. Foreign policy gets bin Laden. Iraq gets a little better. Afghanistan gets a little worse. Benghazi is kind of a scandal that folks got killed over there. And ISIS gets stronger and stronger, and the headway made against ISIS, kind of like the headway over the economy, was kind of a gradual thing, and so folks get frustrated with that. Got reelected. Unemployment was kind of down to 7%. Remember, it was up to 7% under H.W. Bush, down to 7%. Romney wasn't, I like Romney, but he wasn't a very effective candidate. And so Obama got reelected. And that's it. And let's look over here. And that's it. So let's go over here. And what do I need to do to stop the sucker? I can't remember. Oh, here's what it is. I hit this.